The crowd gathers in tense silence. A man once adorned in silk and gold now stands half-naked, bound to the execution wheel. His eyes dart from the jeering mob to the shadow of the queen watching from her balcony. Once he was the king's most trusted companion, his laughter echoing in the marble halls, his counsel shaping the fate of the realm. Now the queen's whispers have poisoned the king's ear. Betrayal, they called it. Treason, they said. But she knows the truth. This is not justice. This is revenge, born of jealousy. The executioner raises his blade and the crowd holds its breath. The order has been given. First the mutilation, then the hanging, and he will feel every second of it. What brought a king's beloved friend to this wheel of agony? The answer lies not in any battlefield or foreign conspiracy, but in the jealous heart of a queen who could not bear to share her husband's affections. History remembers kings and queens for their power, their conquests, their monuments of stone and gold, but the shadows of their courts are filled with the names of those who loved them, served them, and died for it. This is the story of a man whose rise to the king's inner circle made him a target, a story of ambition, love, and the ruthless politics of a medieval court, where affection could be more dangerous than treason, and a whispered rumor could become a death sentence. His name was Sir Thomas Aldrich, and his fall from grace was not the work of soldiers or enemies beyond the walls. It came from within, from a queen who could not bear his presence beside her husband, and would stop at nothing to see him destroyed. By the time his sentence was carried out in the courtyard below the royal palace, the kingdom would never be the same, for when a queen decides to destroy the one person her king loves most, she destroys something in the king himself. The winter of 1347 was brutal, and Thomas Aldrich knew the taste of hunger like an old friend. Born the third son of a minor lord whose lands had been ravaged by war, Thomas possessed nothing but his sword, his wit, and an unshakable loyalty that would one day make him the most powerful man in the kingdom and seal his doom. Picture him then, 22 years old, broad-shouldered from years of wielding steel, his dark eyes sharp with intelligence. He had come to court not seeking gold or titles, but survival. The King Edward III had called for men to serve in his guard, and Thomas answered. What he didn't expect was to catch the monarch's attention on his very first day. The incident was simple enough. A would-be assassin had slipped past the outer guards during morning court. While seasoned knights froze in surprise, Thomas moved without hesitation, his blade finding the attacker's throat before the man could reach the throne. But it wasn't the kill that impressed the king. It was what Thomas whispered afterward. "My lord, your left guard was drunk, and your right guard was distracted by the serving girl. Perhaps new arrangements might serve you better." Edward smiled, a rare thing in those days of war and worry. "And what arrangements would you suggest?" "Let me watch your back, your majesty. I have nothing to lose but my life, and everything to gain by keeping yours." From that moment Thomas Aldrich became indispensable. Within months he had transformed from a nameless guardsman into the king's shadow. Where Edward went, Thomas followed, to council meetings where matters of state were debated, to private chambers where the king's fears were shared over wine, to hunting expeditions where monarch and man rode side by side through ancient forests. Thomas possessed that rarest of gifts. He could make the king laugh. In a world of grasping courtiers and calculating nobles, Thomas offered something Edward had almost forgotten: genuine companionship. The court took notice. How could they not? This unknown soldier now sat at the king's right hand during feasts. He wore silk doublets embroidered with gold thread, gifts from his grateful sovereign. He commanded respect from earls and dukes who had waited years for a fraction of the access Thomas enjoyed daily. Servants bowed as deeply to him as they did to the royal family itself. But with elevation came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came whispers. The first hints of jealousy appeared in Queen Isabella's eyes during the feast of St. Michael. She watched from the high table as her husband leaned close to Thomas, sharing some private jest that made them both laugh until tears streamed down their faces. The queen's goblet trembled in her grip. Around them the great hall blazed with torchlight and echoed with the sounds of celebration, but Isabella saw only the growing distance between herself and her husband, a distance that Thomas Aldrich seemed to occupy entirely. You wouldn't believe the subtle cruelty that began to unfold. A seat that was mysteriously unavailable when Thomas approached the royal table, invitations to private gatherings that somehow never reached him, conversations that died the moment he entered a room. The queen never spoke against him directly. She was far too clever for that. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt with the delicacy of a master gardener. "My lord," she would murmur to Edward as they lay in their marriage bed, "do you not think Sir Thomas grows perhaps too comfortable in his position? I heard him giving orders to Lord Pembroke yesterday as if he were the king himself." Thomas is loyal, Isabella. More loyal than half the noble blood in this kingdom. Of course, my love. I only worry that others may not see it as we do. There are whispers, you know, about favoritism, about unnatural attachments. The poison was slow-acting but deadly effective. Edward began to notice things he had previously ignored. The way other nobles deferred to Thomas, the luxury of his chambers, the easy familiarity between them. Doubt, once planted, grows in the fertile soil of a paranoid mind. Thomas, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the trap being woven around him. He saw the Queen's coldness but attributed it to the natural distance between royalty and their servants. He noticed the whispers but dismissed them as court gossip. His loyalty to the king was absolute, his conscience clear. What did he have to fear? Everything. By Christmas of 1348, Isabella had gathered her allies, nobles who resented Thomas's influence, churchmen who whispered about the unholy closeness between king and commoner, merchants who had been passed over for royal favor. She held court in the shadows, never speaking directly against Thomas, but always listening, always encouraging, always feeding the growing resentment with carefully chosen words. The trap was almost ready. Thomas Aldrich, the king's beloved favorite, stood at the pinnacle of power and influence, trusted beyond measure, loved beyond reason. He had no idea that his greatest enemy wore a crown and shared his master's bed. The Queen had found her weapon, and it would be the king himself. Winter's grip tightened on the kingdom, but it was nothing compared to the chill that began to settle over the royal court. Queen Isabella moved with the patience of a spider, spinning her web one silken thread at a time, and Thomas Aldrich, for all his intelligence, never saw the strands closing around him. The campaign began with whispers so soft they barely disturbed the air. A serving girl, well-paid and well-coached, mentioned to her mistress that Sir Thomas had been seen leaving the royal treasury with unusual frequency. A minor lord, deep in debt to the crown, suggested that perhaps Thomas's new wealth came from sources beyond the king's generosity. Nothing direct, nothing traceable, just seeds of suspicion scattered like autumn leaves on the wind. Isabella was masterful in her subtlety. She never spoke Thomas's name in accusation. Instead, she mastered the art of the pregnant pause, the meaningful glance, the carefully timed sigh. When Edward praised Thomas's counsel during a difficult negotiation with the French, Isabella would nod approvingly and say, "How fortunate we are to have such dedicated service," her voice carrying just enough hesitation to plant doubt without raising suspicion. The first crack appeared during the spring campaign preparations. Thomas had suggested a particular strategy for the siege of Calais, one that had worked brilliantly in previous conflicts, but Isabella had been whispering to her brother-in-law, the Duke of Lancaster, about Thomas's growing presumption in military matters. When the Duke publicly questioned the wisdom of taking advice from a mere guardsman with no noble blood, Edward found himself torn between loyalty to his friend and deference to established hierarchy. Picture the scene: the War Council chamber, heavy with the smoke of oil lamps and the weight of strategic planning. Maps covered the great oak table, marked with the movements of armies and the positions of enemies. Thomas stood behind the king's chair, his usual place, but for the first time Edward seemed uncomfortable with his proximity. "Perhaps," the king said slowly, his eyes not meeting Thomas's, "we should consider the Duke's concerns. After all, tradition has value in matters of war." Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet, but he attributed it to the natural caution of leadership. He had no way of knowing that Isabella had spent the previous evening planting careful suggestions about his dangerous influence over royal decisions. The whisper campaign escalated with surgical precision. A letter forged in Thomas's hand was discovered by a servant in the French ambassador's quarters. It contained nothing treasonous, merely a friendly correspondence about hunting techniques, but Isabella made sure it reached the king with breathless urgency, as if it were evidence of secret negotiations. "I'm certain there's an innocent explanation," she told Edward, her voice heavy with false reassurance. "Sir Thomas would never. But darling, you must admit it does look rather suspicious. A private correspondence with the French during wartime." Edward's trust, once unshakable, began to erode like a riverbank in flood season. He started noticing things that had never troubled him before. How easily Thomas commanded the respect of foreign dignitaries. How frequently he was consulted on matters of state policy. How other nobles seemed to defer to his judgment even in the king's presence. The Queen's poison worked its way through his veins, changing loyalty into suspicion, love into doubt. You have to understand the psychology at play here. Edward was a king constantly surrounded by people who wanted something from him: land, titles, gold, power. Thomas had been the one person who seemed to want nothing but his friendship, but Isabella's whispers transformed that very virtue into a vice. If Thomas wanted nothing, then perhaps his motives were more sinister than simple greed. Perhaps his loyalty masked something darker. The most devastating blow came during the Feast of Pentecost. Isabella had arranged for a troubadour to perform, a man she had carefully selected for his repertoire of songs about treacherous friends and corrupt advisors. As the musicians sang of betrayal, hidden behind smiling faces, Isabella made sure to catch her husband's eye every time the lyrics spoke of trusted companions who sold their master's secrets for foreign gold. Thomas's allies began to abandon him one by one. Some were bought, others threatened. Still others simply saw the way the wind was blowing and adjusted their loyalties accordingly. Lord Pembroke, who had once treated Thomas like a brother, now avoided him in the halls. Sir Geoffrey, his closest companion among the knights, began finding excuses to decline invitations to hunt or feast together. The isolation was calculated and cruel. Isabella understood that a man's friends are his armor against accusation. Strip away that armor, and even the strongest warrior becomes vulnerable. Thomas found himself increasingly alone, dependent entirely on the king's favor, a favor that was visibly cooling with each passing day. The breaking point came when Isabella produced her masterstroke, a witness. She had found a young page, barely 16 and hungry for advancement, who claimed to have overheard Thomas speaking with a cloaked figure in the castle's lower passages. The conversation, according to the boy, involved payments and secrets and promises of future meetings. The page's story was carefully rehearsed, his details perfectly vague, his manner convincingly nervous. When confronted by Edward, Thomas's denials rang hollow against the accumulated weight of insinuation and suspicion. The king wanted to believe his friend. You could see it in his eyes, but doubt had taken root too deeply. The queen had done her work too well. "I swear to you, my lord," Thomas pleaded, his voice raw with desperation, "on my honor, on my life, I have never betrayed your trust. These accusations are like smoke. They seem substantial until you try to grasp them, and then they dissolve into nothing." But Edward was no longer listening with the ears of friendship. He was listening with the ears of a king who had been made to doubt everything he once held sacred. The final trap was set. Isabella arranged for Thomas to be given false information about troop movements, information that would be worthless to any real enemy but would serve her purpose perfectly. When that information was later discovered in the hands of a French spy, another of her carefully placed pawns, the web was complete. The summons came at midnight, delivered by guards Thomas had once commanded. The heavy oak door of his chambers seemed to echo with finality as it closed behind him. He was escorted not to the king's private study, where so many late-night conversations had taken place, but to the dungeons beneath the castle. As the key turned in the lock, Thomas Aldrich, the king's most trusted friend, his closest advisor, his most loyal servant, realized the terrible truth. He was not being held on suspicion of treason. He was being held until his execution, and he knew the doors would not open again. The great hall had been transformed into a theater of judgment, its soaring arches and stained glass windows bearing witness to a spectacle that would haunt the kingdom for generations. Torches blazed in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across the faces of nobles who had gathered like ravens to feast on carrion. This was not justice, this was ceremony, ritual, the public destruction of a man whose only crime was earning a king's love too completely. Thomas Aldrich stood in chains before the throne where he had once stood as a friend. The iron shackles around his wrists were new, but the humiliation they represented cut deeper than any blade. He had been stripped of his fine clothes, his silk doublets and gold-threaded cloaks replaced with rough sackcloth that marked him as a common criminal. But his eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes that had once sparkled with laughter at the king's jests, remained defiant. Edward sat rigid on his throne, every inch the monarch, yet something in his bearing suggested a man at war with himself. Isabella beside him was a vision of regal composure, her hands folded demurely in her lap, her face a mask of sorrowful duty. Only the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth betrayed her satisfaction. The charges were read by the Chancellor, his voice echoing through the hall like a funeral bell. "Sir Thomas Aldrich, you stand accused of high treason against our sovereign lord the king, of conspiring with enemies of the realm, of accepting foreign gold in exchange for secrets of state, of betraying the sacred trust placed in you by His Majesty's grace." Each word fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of whispered commentary through the assembled court. But Thomas heard something else in those accusations, the careful craftsmanship of his destruction, the precision with which each lie had been shaped to fit the narrative of his guilt. "How do you answer these charges?" the Chancellor demanded. Thomas raised his head, his voice carrying despite his bonds. I answer that I have served my king with perfect loyalty from the day I first swore my oath. I have taken no gold but what he gave me in his generosity. I have shared no secrets but those he trusted me to keep. These charges are built on lies, fashioned by those who would see me destroyed for their own purposes. A murmur ran through the hall, part shock at his boldness, part admiration for his courage. But the queen was ready for this. She leaned close to her husband and whispered something that made his jaw tighten with renewed anger. The witnesses began their parade of perjury. The young page stepped forward first, his rehearsed testimony delivered with trembling conviction. He spoke of midnight meetings and cloaked figures, of gold-changing hands and whispered promises. His story was perfect in its vagueness, detailed enough to seem credible, vague enough to avoid contradiction. Thomas watched the boy with something approaching pity. "Tell me, child," he said when given the chance to respond, "how much did they pay you to destroy your soul with these lies?" The page flushed red and stammered, but the damage was done. In the minds of many present, Thomas's question sounded like desperation rather than righteous indignation. The forged letter was produced next, held aloft like a banner of betrayal. The handwriting was expertly copied, the parchment aged with tea and smoke to suggest authenticity. The French ambassador's denial of its significance was dismissed as the expected protestation of a co-conspirator. But it was the testimony of Sir Geoffrey that truly broke Thomas's heart. His former friend, a man with whom he had shared bread and wine, laughter and sorrow, stepped forward with downcast eyes and spoke of suspicious behaviors, of private conversations that seemed to cease whenever others approached, of Thomas's unusual knowledge of French customs and language. "Speak plainly," Thomas called out, his voice cracking with anguish. "You who ate at my table, who called me brother, do you truly believe I am a traitor?" Geoffrey's eyes remained fixed on the floor. I know only what I have observed, my lord, and what I have observed troubles me greatly." The words were carefully chosen, diplomatically neutral, but they carried the weight of condemnation. If Thomas's closest friend harbored doubts about his loyalty, what defense could he possibly offer? The trial proceeded with the inexorable momentum of a landslide. Each witness, each piece of evidence, each carefully orchestrated moment built upon the last, until the conclusion seemed inevitable. Isabella had choreographed this performance with the skill of a master playwright, and every actor played their assigned role to perfection. When Thomas was finally allowed to speak in his own defense, his words carried the passion of absolute truth. He spoke of his devotion to the king, of the sacrifices he had made in service to the crown, of the years spent building the trust that was now being destroyed by jealousy and ambition. His voice rang through the great hall with such conviction that many present felt their certainty waver. But doubt, once planted, is a persistent weed. The accumulated weight of accusation had done its work too well. Even those who wanted to believe in Thomas's innocence found themselves wondering if, perhaps, they had been deceived all along. The king's judgment, when it came, was delivered in a voice that seemed to come from a great distance. Edward's words were formal, ritualistic, drained of the warmth that had once marked every conversation between the two men. "Sir Thomas Aldrich, you have been found guilty of high treason against the crown. The sentence is death." A collective intake of breath swept through the hall, but the king was not finished. Isabella leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with anticipation. She had saved her cruelest stroke for last. However, Edward continued, his voice growing stronger as if drawing resolve from his wife's proximity. "In consideration of your former service, you shall not die by the headsman's axe as befits a knight. You shall die as traitors die, by castration and hanging, that all may see the fate of those who betray their sovereign's trust." The sentence hit the assembled court like a physical blow. Even in an age accustomed to public brutality, the calculated cruelty of it shocked those present into silence. This was not merely execution, it was obliteration, the destruction of Thomas's manhood before the taking of his life. It was a humiliation designed to strip away every shred of dignity and honor he had ever possessed. Thomas swayed on his feet as if struck, but his voice remained steady. "My lord, I go to my death as I have lived, faithful to you and to the truth. God knows my innocence, and before him I will answer for my deeds. But I pray that someday you will learn whose lies have led you to this moment, and I pray you will forgive yourself when that day comes." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and for a moment something flickered in the king's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the ghost of old affection. But Isabella's hand found his arm, her touch gentle yet possessive, and the moment passed. As the guards led Thomas away, the crowd began to roar, some calling for mercy, others for blood, all of them caught up in the terrible drama that had just unfolded before them. The queen sat back in her throne with the satisfaction of a chess master who had just declared checkmate. The crowd roared for blood, their voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling like the baying of hounds. From her seat beside the king, Queen Isabella allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Justice, she called it. But in the shadows of the great hall, among the servants and the lesser nobles who had watched a good man destroyed by lies, they whispered a different word: murder, and the queen smiled. Dawn broke gray and cold over the castle courtyard, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the ice that had settled in the hearts of those who truly knew Thomas Aldrich. The execution platform stood like an altar of cruelty in the center of the stone-paved space, its wooden beams dark with the stains of previous judgments. But this was no ordinary execution. This was theater, a carefully orchestrated display of royal power and the price of betrayal. The crowd had been gathering since before first light, drawn by the promise of spectacle and the morbid curiosity that marks humanity's darker impulses. Merchants abandoned their stalls, craftsmen their workshops, nobles their breakfast tables. Word had spread through the kingdom like wildfire. The king's favorite was to die, and die horribly, as a lesson to all who might consider treachery. Queen Isabella had positioned herself perfectly for the performance on the covered balcony overlooking the courtyard, close enough to see every detail yet elevated enough to remain untouchable. She wore black silk, ostensibly in mourning for the betrayal of trust, but her eyes held the bright satisfaction of a woman who had fought a war and won it completely. Beside her, the king sat rigid as carved stone, his face a mask that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. The crowd's murmur died to expectant silence as the castle doors groaned open. Thomas emerged flanked by guards, his wrists still bound, his head held high despite everything that was about to unfold. The rough sackcloth had been replaced by a simple white shirt, traditional garb for the condemned, but even in his extremity, he carried himself with the dignity of a man who knew his own worth. You could see the shock ripple through the assembled masses as they got their first clear look at him. This was not the broken, cowering wretch they had expected, but a man who faced his death with courage intact. Some in the crowd began to whisper among themselves. Was this really the face of treachery, or were they witnessing something far more sinister? The executioner waited by his wheel, a massive man whose face was hidden behind a leather hood. His tools were laid out with professional precision: the curved blade for the castration, the rope for the hanging, the oil-soaked rags to tend his fire. He had performed this duty many times before, but never for someone who had stood so close to the throne. Even he seemed unsettled by the weight of the moment. Thomas was forced to kneel before the platform while the charges were read once more, a ritual humiliation designed to break his spirit before his body was broken. But when the chancellor finished his recitation and asked if the condemned had any final words, Thomas's voice rang clear across the courtyard. "Good people of the realm, I stand before you condemned of treason, but I swear before God and all his saints that I am innocent of these charges. I have served my king with perfect loyalty, and if that loyalty has brought me to this place, then I count it a blessing rather than a curse. Remember me not as the traitor they have named me, but as a man who loved his king too well to save himself with lies." The crowd stirred uneasily. These were not the words of a guilty man begging for mercy, but the testimony of someone facing death with conscience clear. In the balcony above, Isabella's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Even in defeat, Thomas threatened to undermine her victory. The physical ordeal began with methodical cruelty. Thomas was stripped to the waist and bound to the execution wheel, his arms spread wide, his body exposed to the cold air and colder stares of the crowd. The executioner approached with his blade, heated red-hot in the brazier's flames. The first cut drew a sharp intake of breath from the assembled watchers, not from Thomas, who bit his lips bloody rather than cry out, but from those who witnessed his agony. The castration was performed with deliberate slowness, designed for maximum pain and humiliation. Thomas's body convulsed against his bonds, sweat pouring down his face despite the morning chill, but still he did not scream. His silence became a form of defiance that unnerved even his executioner. In the balcony, the king's knuckles were white where he gripped his chair's arms, and something dark flickered behind his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the first stirring of terrible understanding. What happened next would be whispered about in the kingdom's darkest corners for decades to come. As the executioner prepared the rope for the final act, a voice rang out from the crowd, not the bloodthirsty roar they had expected, but a woman's voice, clear and strong. God knows his innocence. The cry was taken up by others, scattered at first but growing stronger. Innocent, innocent. The crowd that had come for blood began to turn, their mood shifting like wind before a storm. They had watched a good man die with dignity, while his accusers sat safe in their elevated seats, and the contrast was not lost on them. Isabella leaned forward, her composure cracking for the first time. This was not how the script was supposed to unfold. The crowd should have been satisfied with their spectacle, not questioning the justice they had witnessed. Her eyes found the king's, and for a moment she saw something that made her blood freeze. Doubt, real doubt, the kind that once rooted could destroy everything she had built. The hanging itself was almost anticlimactic after the brutal mutilation that had preceded it. Thomas was hauled upright, the noose placed around his neck with professional efficiency. But even as the rope tightened and his feet left the ground, his eyes found the king's through the crowd and the distance between them. In that final moment, there was no hatred in his gaze, only sorrow. Sorrow for his own fate, yes, but more than that, sorrow for what his death would cost the man he had served so faithfully. Edward felt that look like a physical blow. In Thomas's dying eyes, he saw not the guilt of a traitor but the forgiveness of a friend. The realization hit him with devastating force. He had not executed a traitor. He had murdered the one person in the world who had loved him without agenda, without price, without condition. The crowd's roar had died to an uncomfortable silence, broken only by scattered sobs from those who had known Thomas personally. The Queen's victory celebration felt suddenly hollow, tainted by the very public doubt of those who had witnessed the execution. This was supposed to have been her triumph, but instead it felt like the beginning of something darker, a crack in the foundation of royal authority that would widen with time. As Thomas's body hung lifeless from the gallows, swaying gently in the morning breeze, a child in the crowd pointed upward and spoke with the clarity that only innocence can provide. "Mama, why did they hurt the good man?" The question hung in the air unanswered because there was no answer that would satisfy. Justice had not been served here. A good man had been destroyed by jealousy, ambition, and lies so skillfully crafted that even the king himself had been deceived. In the days that followed, Thomas's body remained displayed as a warning to others, but the whispers in the castle corridors told a different story. The servants who had known him spoke of his kindness, his generosity, his unwavering loyalty. The guards who had served under him remembered his fairness and courage. The nobles who had benefited from his counsel began to question the evidence that had condemned him. And in the royal chambers late at night when the castle was quiet, the king sat alone with his wine and his growing certainty that he had been played for a fool. The realization was eating him alive from the inside, but it was too late, far too late to undo what had been done. The king had lost his most loyal friend, his truest advisor, his most faithful servant, but he never knew whose hand had truly killed him, not until it was far too late to matter. The execution of Sir Thomas Aldrich marked a turning point in the kingdom's history, though few recognized it at the time. What seemed like the triumph of justice over treachery was in truth the moment when paranoia and jealousy claimed their greatest victory over love and loyalty. Queen Isabella's power grew unchecked in the months that followed, her influence over the king absolute. She had removed the one voice that might have counseled against her ambitions, the one presence that reminded Edward of who he had been before the crown made him suspicious of every shadow. With Thomas gone, there was no one left to whisper truths that power didn't want to hear. But power built on lies is a fragile thing. The servants never forgot Thomas's kindness. The guards never stopped speaking of his honor. The nobles who had witnessed his death with dignity began to look more closely at the evidence that had condemned him, and found it wanting. Truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's been buried. Within a year, irregularities in the Queen's accounting were discovered. Gold that should have gone to the royal treasury had found its way into private coffers. Letters were uncovered, real letters this time, revealing correspondence with foreign agents that bore a striking resemblance to the fabricated evidence used against Thomas. The very crimes for which he had died were being committed, in reality by the woman who had orchestrated his destruction. When the king finally understood the full scope of his wife's deception, the knowledge destroyed something fundamental in him. He had not merely killed an innocent man, he had killed the one person whose love for him had been pure and unconditional. The guilt consumed him like a cancer, turning a once generous ruler into a paranoid tyrant who trusted no one and saw enemies in every shadow. Isabella's reign of influence ended as bloodily as it had begun. When Edward discovered her treachery, his rage was terrible to behold. The queen who had manipulated justice to destroy a good man found herself facing the very wheel to which she had condemned Thomas Aldrich. The irony was not lost on those who remembered. But for Thomas, vindication came too late. His name was eventually cleared, his reputation restored, his memory honored, but the man himself remained forever silent, forever lost to the kingdom that had needed his wisdom, his loyalty, his steadying presence beside a king who was all too human in his failings. History records the execution of Sir Thomas Aldrich as a miscarriage of justice, but but in the whispered conversations of the palace servants, in the guilty memories of those who had stood silent while a good man died, it is remembered as something far worse. It is remembered as the day a kingdom lost its soul to jealousy, and a queen's ambition left a stain on the crown that no amount of time could wash clean. And sometimes, they say, on cold mornings when the mist rises from the castle courtyard, you can still see a figure standing by the old execution platform, a man in simple clothes, patient and dignified, waiting for a justice that will never come, watching over a kingdom that destroyed him for the crime of loving his king too well. The shadow of what Isabella had done would linger in the silent corridors of the royal court, long after her own bones had turned to dust. Some betrayals echo through eternity, and the murder of innocence leaves scars that never truly heal. Her reign would end as bloodily as it began, but that perhaps is a story for another dark night, when the wind howls through the castle walls and the ghosts of the past refuse to stay buried.